Hello, everybody. I hope you all are happy and healthy, and for your families too. I hope that they are all healthy. Today, in our today's session, we will talk about the XP methodology, one of the agile methodologies that we are going to introduce in our course. But before starting the XP process, I want you to ask your questions from the last session, from the Scrum methodology. Mr. Taher, midterm has 8 points. Midterm has 8 points. And the final is also 8 points. And your research has about 4 points. Okay, today we can talk about the midterm 2, your midterm exam. Yes, Mr. Abid. We can talk about midterm exam, but before that I waited for you so you can ask your questions about the Scrum process. So if you have any question about the Scrum methodology, please ask your question. Then we can talk about the midterm exam and also about the new slide, the XP process. So if you have any question about the agile methodologies, the basics, and also about the Scrum process, please ask your question. Okay, so let's talk about the midterm exam. Your midterm exam is at the end of Azar. So the time of midterm exam is on Monday. It's Monday. It's on Monday, 29 of Azar at 8 p.m. And before that, I will give you some sample questions. So you can get familiar with the questions in your midterm exam. And so in the exam, we have two types of questions. We have multiple choices questions, and also we have the descriptive questions. And for descriptive questions, there are text boxes that you can enter your question, or if you want, you can write down on the paper and upload a picture of your answers. Yes, Mr. Taher. No, this time because your classmates has asked to change the scores. We have 8 points for midterm and 8 points for your final exam. Thank you, Mr. Taher. If there is any other questions about your midterm exam, please ask your question. Okay, so if there is not any question, then we can start our today's session. Yes, Mr. Abid, I will talk about that, or yes, Mr. Kashosh. Yes, you can have those sample questions for the exam. The exam can take about 1 hour. So your exam will take about 1 hour. Mr. Abid, I think about 10 or 15. About 10 or 15 questions. Yes, Mr. Abid, yes, you have enough time to answer the questions because some of the questions are multiple choices and you don't need so much time to answer those questions. Yes, Mr. Abid, if anyone has any problem with the connection, with internet connection, then please tell me in the chat box of the ARSO website. So if there is any problem, in your exam or during your exam, uh, send a message to me in the ARSO website. Okay, so if you had any problem, please send me a message. Okay, so if anyone had any question, please send a message in Darsa website. Yes, Mr. Obaid. No, please don't send the answers in WhatsApp. Please send it in Darsa website only. Mr. Zuaid, it's just a midterm exam. So your final exam is later. Thank you, Mr. Zuaid. Okay, any other question? Okay, Mr. Obaid, so please answer the questions only in Darsa website. Thank you, Mr. Obaid. Thank you very much. No, Mr. Tahir. Mr. Tahir, Osman, no, not Amazon, just Darsa website. The Darsa website. You can go to the Darsa website and I will define a midterm exam. In the next session, I try to create the exam and talk about the exam more. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so we can start our today's session on the XP Pro. Uh, okay, I have a problem in showing the slide. Let me open the slide again. I'm uploading the slides again. After the upload has been completed, we can resume our class. Okay, so let's talk about the XP process, one of the other agile methodologies. XP process is also as famous and important as the Scrum process. The XP is abbreviation of extreme programming. Extreme programming. So it sounds from the name that the programming and coding and implementation is very important in this process. The XP process was developed by Mr. Beck in 1996, but the first authentic XP book appeared in 1999, about 3 years later. And also we have a revised and refined version in 2004. So the version that we are using today is that revised version. We have some other agile methodologies that are older than XP, but the importance of the XP methodology or the XP process is that it helped spark the agile movement. one of the processes that helped in the formation of the agile movement is the XP process. So it's very important because it helped emerge the agile movement. Sometimes the practitioners of the XP process consider it as a software engineering discipline rather than a methodology, but the XP methodology does incorporate a process, so we can consider it as a complete methodology. Let's talk about the XP process. The XP process has 6 phases. We have 6 phases, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 phases. The first phase is the exploration. In the exploration, we have 2 main activities. First, to develop a list of high-level requirements from our user. So we have a list of high-level requirements in the form of user stories. And based on those requirements, those high-level requirements, we can determine the overall design of the system. And we can use prototyping for designing the system and getting feedback from our users. The second phase is planning, the biggest planning for the whole release, so it's called release planning. In the release planning phase, we need to do 3 activities. The first one is to estimate the time that is required for the implementation of each requirement. So from the list of requirements that we have, we will estimate the required time for implementing each one of those requirements. Then we can prioritize the requirements in that list based on the required time, based on other factors such as the final value of that requirement to our users. And then we can use this list, the prioritized list with the estimation of requirements, to create a schedule, and we should select a core set of requirements, a minimal set of requirements that should be implemented for the first release of the system. The first release of the system is very important in the XP process because it is the core of our final software. It's going to be loaded, it's going to be running through the other phases of the XP process. So it's very important to select the right requirements for the first release. The third phase is the iterations to first release. So based on the requirements that we selected for the first release, we do an iterative development approach. So we have an iterative development here in the third phase. We do an iterative development and implement the first release of the system. The XP process has some specific rules and some specific practices which are prescribed by the XP. And using the iterations, short iterations that are usually between 1 to 3 weeks, the duration of each iteration is between 1 to 3 weeks. Then we can implement the first version of our system and release that core version. The fourth phase is Mr. Aliaseri. It's a recurring version. We have we're going to repeat some activities. I'm going to talk about this in this picture. We have some activities: analysis, design, planning for testing, and testing. In the third phase, we have iterations. Each iteration we have some activities. We do these activities repetitively to implement the requirements. So we're going to repeat these tasks. Okay. The fourth phase is the productionizing. Productionizing is generally the verification and validation step of our process, the testing step. V&V, verification and validation. In a system level, we have a system level verification and validation for the first release. And after the testing, after the V&V, we have the deployment. We're going to deploy the first version, the first release into the user's environment. So the first release, the core version, is going to be deployed before other requirements are implemented. It's very important to know that the first version is going to be run, is going to be under load before other requirements are implemented. The fifth phase is maintenance. Maintenance is a repetitive phase. It's the repetition of the core phases, phase 2, 3, and 4, which are called the development engine, phases 2, 3, and 4. In the maintenance, we have these 3 phases to be repeated for implementing the remaining requirements. And after implementing those requirements, we're going to integrate them into the running system. We're going to integrate those new implemented requirements into the running system. So the maintenance is includes iteration of phases 2, 3, and 4. Do you have my sound? Do you have my voice, Mr. Asharifi? You have problems? Do you have my voice now? Is it clear now? Can you hear my voice now? Clear? Thank you, Mr. Tahir. Thank you, Mr. Hossein. Okay, if you have any problem in the voice or in the picture, then you can watch the offline version of our course. I have uploaded a version, an offline version of all the slides on the Darsa website, so you can watch the offline version of our course. Okay? Thank you. The last phase is the death phase, which is the closing of the project, and if we have to do any post-mortem review and documentation so they can be reused for the other projects, they can be done in the last phase. And no, Mr. Al-Yaseri, it doesn't mean the failure. It means that the project is not maintainable. We cannot, it's impossible to maintain the project. We need a new software. It's not the failure, it means the life cycle of the project is finished. Okay, Mr. Az-Zubaydi, the sessions, I think we have the slide number 1, 2, 3, and 4. We can talk about this in the next weeks. but I think we have the slide number 1 to slide number 4 for the exam. Planning is no, not the operating system development, Mr. Zovaid. Mr. Zovaid, these are not the operating system. These are for the final software that we are developing. These are the phases that are required in the XP process. And we can implement any software with the XP process. Not any, we can do the right projects, the project that the XP process is proper for them, not only just the operating system. If you mean the running version, the first version of the system, we have all, we have the first release. Yes, Mr. Zovaid, for the first version you mean? The first version, we have here the first version. Yes, Mr. Azovaidi, we can have unit testing and automated testing. I will talk about the automated testing. In the maintenance phase and in the productionizing phase, in this phase, we're going to test the system, and we have acceptance tests, and we have regression tests. So we're going to repeat lots of tests again and again and again. So we need to use automated testing. We need to use automated frameworks or automated tools for software testing. Okay, let's have a look on to this picture. Thank you, Mr. Azobaidi. Each column is one phase. This is phase 1, exploration phase. The next column, it's the second phase, phase number 2, planning phase. This is the third phase, iteration to release phase, phase number 3. Phase number 4, productionizing phase, phase number 4. Phase number 5, maintenance phase. And the last phase, the death phase, phase number 6. In the first phase, we need to have requirements of the user in the form of user stories. So we have user stories here. In the planning phase, we will first estimate the time and the effort that is required for implementing each user story, for each story, for each requirements, for each story. Yes, Mr. Ali Yaseri, stories are user requirements. Yes, it's correct. We're going to estimate the time and the effort required for each story, and then we need to prioritize them. We need to create an ordered list of requirements. We need to prioritize the stories, the requirements, and select some of those important stories, some of the high priority stories for the first version, for the first release, for the next iteration, for this phase. After selecting the user stories, we need to implement them, implement the first version of our software. So we have a repetitive work here. We have an iteration, an iterative approach for implementing those requirements. We do analysis, design, planning for testing, and testing to create the new functionality, to implement the new requirement. After enough testing, we will integrate the code into a collective code base. So we have continuous integration, integrate the new code, the code that is tested, into the collective code base. And we can use the feedback of users, the feedback of testing process, testing activity for the next iteration. After some iterations, 1 iteration, 2 iteration, 3 iteration, 4 iteration, and so on. After some iterations, we have implemented all the requirements for the first version, for the first release. And then we're going to do an acceptance test. In the productionizing phase, we do an acceptance test. And we will have small releases, our first release of the software. After the first release, in the maintenance phase, we will update our release with implementing new requirements, implementing the remained requirements in the list. We have a list of requirements here. So in the maintenance, we will repeat phase number 2, phase number 3, and phase number 4 for implementing other requirements and updating the first release. This is a general picture for the XP process, but we will talk about each one of these phases in more detail in the next slide. So let's talk about the development engine. Development engine is phase number 2, phase number 3, and phase number 4. These 3 phases, these are called the development engine. So the development engine, here is the development engine. Okay, Mr. Al-Yasiri. Yes, Mr. Al-Yasiri. The acceptance test, testing by the user, is here in the productionizing phase. After that, we can release the new version, the updated version. If the user have new requirements, Mr. Abid, if the user have new requirements in the maintenance, we're going to get back to the list of stories. So if we have new requirements, we can add those requirements into the stories here, into the list, and then we can implement those new requirements too. So it's possible to add new requirements to the list. Okay, let's go further. Some of your questions will be answered in the next slides. So we have a first release of our system, a core version of our system to be produced and also deployed. and then we're going to incrementally improve the system and complement the requirements in the list. We're going to incrementally complement the system into the during the maintenance phase. So by repeating the development engine, by doing the development engine again and again in new iterations, we have new versions of our system with more capabilities, with new functionalities. This is another picture of the XP process. In this picture, we have the maintenance phase. The maintenance phase includes phase number 2, planning, phase number 3, iterations to release, and phase number 4, productionizing. So the maintenance includes these 3 phases. In the maintenance, we're going to have iterations on planning, iterations on release, and on productionizing. This is the first phase, the exploration phase. We have the user story and we have the architectural spike. We have some activities here: release planning, iterations, acceptance test, and small releases. We have activities in these 3 phases, and also we have some inputs and outputs. We will talk about all of these concepts in this picture. Before that, let's talk about the exploration again. We're going to talk first about the exploration, the first phase. Let's talk about the exploration, and then we're going to talk about these, and then we're going to talk about all these phases then. Okay, if you agree, we can have a quick break, and after the break, we can talk about the exploration. Okay, so similar basics. Okay, if you agree, we can continue our session. Before that, let's talk about the question of Mr. Al-Hajami. Mr. Al-Hajami, the difference between Scrum and XP process. Okay. We have different methodologies in agile processes, in agile methodologies. The base and the core of these methodologies are very similar. So the XP process and the Scrum process have very similar basics, but there are some differences in their details. For example, in the XP and in the Scrum, we have both iterations. In the Scrum, we have iterations, the execution, it's all iterations. And in the XP process also, we have iterations. In the next slides, we can see that in the XP process, we have the stand-up meetings every day, just like the Scrum. In the Scrum, we have daily Scrums every day. So these are very similar. But there are some details that are different in the XP process and in the Scrum process. For example, the iterations are different. In the XP process, we have shorter iterations between 1 to 3 weeks, but in the Scrum we have longer iterations, about 1 month. The most important difference between the XP and the Scrum, I think that there is the running version that is created in the XP process. In the XP process, we will deploy the first version, and after that we're going to improve that first version. It's very important. And there are some differences in the activities. For example, in the XP process, we have the testing activity. We have a very independent activity for testing. It's very important. And also we have design activities. The architectural spike is the design activity. So the design activities and the test activities are very bold in the XP process. But in the Scrum, if you remember, we don't have these two activities. We could have tasks for testing or tasks for designing, but we didn't have independent phases or independent activities for testing and for designing. So they are very similar in the basics, but there are detailed differences between them too. Thank you, Mr. Al-Hajami, for your very good questions. Thank you very much. Okay, let's go back to the first phase, the exploration phase. This is the exploration phase. Let's talk first about the exploration phase and then go to the maintenance phase or the development NG. In the exploration phase, the first activity is to form our team, the development team. We should find the skillful and also talented individuals for our team. In the XP development team, we have a coach. The coach role is a monitor or a facilitator for our meetings, for the meetings of the development team. So we need a coach. We need a number of programmers with different expertise that are required for the project. So we need a number of programmers. And also we need a business representative. A business representative, which is usually from the customer side. This business representative can help us with the informations and also feedbacks that are required to get from the user or from the customer. So it's very important to have the user just beside us. We need a business representative. These are the main roles that we need in our development team, but we can have a number of analysts, a number of testers, independent testers that are not from our development team, outside of our development team, with testing expertise to help us define acceptance test. And also it's very good to have a resource manager. So beside the coach, the group of programmers and the business representative that must be in the team, it's very good to have a number of analysts and testers and a resource manager. So the first activity in the exploration phase is to build our team, our development team. The next activity is to create the initial set of user stories, a list of user requirements in the form of user stories. We need to define each feature that is required for our system from the customer's point of view. So it's very important to know the users of the needs of our customers. This initial list, this initial set is usually written by the customer. So the customer will use his own terminology for defining the user stories. So two important points for user stories. First, these requirements are from the customer's point of view, and second, the customer write these stories, so he or she will use his or her terminology to describe those requirements. In the XP process, we use index cards for each requirement, for each user story. We will create an index card, write each user story on one index card. For each user story, we need a short description, about 3 sentences, and also some functionality needs that must be provided or delivered by the system. Based on these user stories, we can create the system metaphor. The system metaphor is a prototype which is called a spike or spike solution. The spike or spike solution is a prototype which is developed and explored the potential architectures of the system. This prototype will help the team to define the system metaphor. The system metaphor is a very simple and high-level description of how the system should work. So first, the customer create the user story, then the development team create a prototype which is called a spike or spike solution, which represent the potential architectures of the system, and then they create the metaphor. The metaphor is a high-level description of how the system should work. The metaphor is usually created in the form of a description by analogy, so it can be very easily understandable to all team members. The metaphor will give the team an extremely useful idea of the overall architecture of the system. The first phase, the exploration phase, has two main outputs. First, a list of user stories, a set of user stories, and second, the metaphor of the system and the spike solution. Okay, Mr. Ali Yaseri. Mr. Ali Yaseri, we will do the exploration as the first phase. So it's not going to be repetitive. The exploration phase is not repetitive. Not every month, just in the first phase. Okay, Mr. Ali Yaseri? Yes, Mr. Ali Yaseri, we have very short period, about 1, 2, 3 weeks, less than a month, very short period. And Mr. Azobaidi. Yes, Mr. Azobaidi, the user stories are very important in the XP process because they are the base of system. We will do the tests based on user stories. We will implement the functionalities, new functionalities on the user stories, so they are very important. Yes, Mr. Azobaidi, user stories are very important in the XP process. Thank you, Mr. Ali Osiri. Thank you, Mr. Azobaidi, for your good question. Please, if there is any other question, please ask. Okay, so this was the exploration phase, user stories and architectural spike. Now let's talk about phase number 2, phase number 3, and phase number 4, which are called development engine. The development engine. The development engine is in the previous picture here. Here we have the development engine, phase number 2, phase number 3, phase number 4. We have some activities in the development engine: release planning, planning phase, and creating the spike, a release plan, iteration, acceptance test, and customer approval and small releases. These are the high-level activities in the development engine. We have all of them here: release planning, spike, release plan, iteration, acceptance test, and small release. This picture is a bigger picture of these activities. They are identical. The activities in the development engine. Let's talk about the activities, top level activities in the development engine. In the development engine, we have two important activities. First, release planning. Second, iterations. The input to the development engine are user stories. User stories are foundation of our requirements that are input to the release planning activity. And also the user stories are based of our acceptance tests. We will create the test scenarios based on these user stories and create the acceptance test based on them. Another input to the development engine is the architectural spike. The system metaphor is created from the architectural spike and is used in the release planning. In the release planning, all the requirements in our list are estimated. We have uncertain estimate and then create the spike solution, and based on that we can have confident estimates. So in the release planning, first we will estimate the required time or effort for implementing each requirement, and based on that we will create a release plan. The release plan is used in the iteration activity. Here we have the iteration activity. After doing the iteration activity, we have the latest version of our system. And also we use our information and we use our experiment in the iterations and calculate the project velocity. We will have the project velocity and use it in the next iteration to do the release planning. The project velocity means how effective is the team for implementing the requirements. The latest version should be tested by the acceptance tests that are written by some expert testers. And all the bugs that are found in this version should be corrected in the iterations and be used in the acceptance tests of the next iteration. After all the tests have been passed and we have the customer approval, then a small release of the project can be created. So we have top level activities of development engine, which are release planning, iteration, acceptance test, and small release. Now let's talk about the iteration. Let's talk about the release planning, this activity, the release planning. The first activity is the release planning. What is the release planning? In the release planning, we have the list of our user stories, the list of requirements which are created by the customer, and we need to estimate the development time for each user story, for each requirement. We need to estimate the time or effort that is required to develop each one of those user stories. Developers will estimate the user stories based on the system metaphor, and then they will write the estimates on the index card for each user story. We said before that for each user story we have an index card. The estimation should be written on that index card too. If we have user stories that will take more than 3 weeks, then we need to break them down into smaller one, which can be smaller than 3 weeks, because we have a limitation in XP process that our iteration cannot be longer than 3 weeks. And also if we have user stories that the time for developing them is less than 1 week, then we need to merge those small user stories and create new stories that can take more than 1 week and less than 3 weeks. So we have a constraint here for our iteration. The time for each iteration must be between 1 to 3 weeks, not less than 1 week and not more than 3 weeks. And if we cannot provide reliable estimates because we don't have enough information, then we will create the spike solution, and the spike solutions can be discussed on the spike solutions with other stakeholders, for example with the customer, and we can improve our estimates using that spike solution. After estimation, we need to prioritize the list of user stories. The customer should prioritize the user stories based on their business value. So it's very important to have different factors for prioritizing user stories. For example, we can use the time or the importance of that user story. With this information, with the estimation and the prioritization, we can plan the first release. We can select the team, the development team can select a minimal set of user stories, the most important user stories that must be provided to the user in the first release. And also the team should decide on the iteration duration for all the project. So if we decide that our iterations should be for example 2 weeks, all the iterations should be 2 weeks, not longer and not shorter than that. Mr. Ali Yasseri, no, we don't have different teams. We have just one team of programmers, of developers. Beside the developers, we can have a resource manager, and we can have some analysts or some testers, and we need to have a coach. But all these estimations are done by the development team, not a separate team. Okay, we just have one team of our programmers. Okay, thank you, Mr. Ali Yasseri. Yes, Mr. Azobeidi, we have daily cycles, stand-up meetings every day for all the iterations, not just for first release, but also for other improvements for the next releases too. For all the development process, we will have daily stand-up meetings. Okay. Okay, I think we need to leave these slides for the next session because we don't have enough time to go to the iteration phase. In the next session, we will talk about the iteration phase and all those remaining phases, the iteration activity and all those remaining phases of the XP process. Okay, so if you have any question from this, Mr. Ali Yasseri, the extreme programming, because the main focus is on programming, is on implementing. The main focus is on programming. We use pair programming in the extreme programming in the iterations to first release. So the extreme programming means our focus is on programming, is on implementing. Okay, thank you very much everyone for being present in our class, for participating in our class. Thank you for your very good questions. They are very helpful for understanding the concepts of this course. Thank you very much for your questions. And if you don't have any other question, we can finish our session today. Okay, thank you very much. Have a good day and goodbye. خدا حافظ. خدا نگهدار. خسته نباشید. خدا نگهدار.